The latest Ghibli film is about a lot of things. It's about war, it's about trauma, it's about the power and escapism of fantasy, but at its heart, it's about that melancholy. And it's about the man himself, Hayao Miyazaki.
If you've ever engaged with animation enthusiasts, chances are the name Hayao Miyazaki has come up in conversation. His works as an animator, manga artist, and film director are widely known, and he's internationally revered as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. His commitment to hand-drawn animation helps him stand out amongst other animation filmmakers, and his devotion to his craft has pulled him out of retirement at least 4 different times. This is the story of Hayao Miyazaki, and how his films changed the world.
It's increasingly rare that we have such moments of peace and contemplation. Usually in film, this thought and reflection from the audience comes straight after the closing shot, or perhaps not at all. But Miyazaki recognises that this is not what life is like. Despite our hectic lifestyles, we'll always be sat in a quiet car or a lowly lit dining room or in a train listening to nothing but the tracks beneath your feet.
Hayao Miyazaki was born on January 5, 1941 in Tokyo City, just months before Japan entered World War II. At 3 years old, his family evacuated to the city of Utsunomiya before it was decimated by bombs when he was 4. This early experience of trauma gave him a lasting disdain for topics of war, and he'd occasionally argue with his father over his involvement in it. Miyazaki's father, Katsuji Miyazaki, directed and operated his family's own aeronautics company that produced airplane parts, many of which were used in the war. But despite this connection, Miyazaki grew up fascinated with airplane mechanics and the potential of flight. He was an ill child, physically weaker than his peers due to his fragile health, so he spent most of his time entertaining himself by reading books and drawing pictures. This gave him a fascination with visual storytelling, but he couldn't shake an inferiority complex created by his weak constitution. When he was 6 years old, his mother Yoshiko Miyazaki became bedridden with tuberculosis, and the sight of his strong mother going too weak to display any of her affection scarred him. He would distract himself from this grim reality through his drawings, but deep down he began to wish he hadn't been born. After graduating college, Miyazaki began working as an animator at Toei Animation in 1963. He'd received lots of praise from his colleagues who declared that his drawings brimmed with imagination, and those praises began to quell his feelings of inferiority. Thus, animation became his new purpose in life, and he'd grow up to say, "If I can entertain people, maybe I deserve to exist. I have this repressed need to feel useful." While working at Toei Animation, Miyazaki would rise through the ranks and become the key animator for many early TV productions. In 1967, Miyazaki would have his first son, Goro Miyazaki, at the age of 26, and he would create many small animations for him as well. In 1968, Toei would release The Great Adventure of Horus, Prince of the Sun, which Miyazaki worked on as chief animator, concept artist, and scene designer. This film was directed by Isao Takahata, or Paku as Miyazaki liked to call him, and this collaboration of theirs would become the start of a lasting friendship between the two. Miyazaki would leave Toei Animation in 1971 to work again with Takahata on various other productions. In 1978, Miyazaki had his directorial debut with the TV series Future Boy Conan, and as his popularity began to rise, so did his expectations. In 1979, at the age of 38, he directed his first feature anime film, Lupin III: The Castle of Cagliostro. While his work stood out for having meticulous animation detail, heightened sensory colors, and a unique sense of action for character building, the film ended up obscured by the popularity of sci-fi in Japan at the time, and Miyazaki was left without any directorial jobs for a while. During this period, he'd create original concept art for future films like My Neighbor Totoro, Princess Mononoke, and Castle in the Sky, but these ideas of his would collect dust before ever being revisited. In 1981, Miyazaki was approached by his friend and longtime collaborator Toshio Suzuki to create a manga called Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Miyazaki's dedication to detail in both character designs and setting helped the manga reach a wide audience. He even included maps within the volumes to ensure the audience comprehends the scale of the story. About a year later, the popularity of the manga convinced Suzuki to ask Miyazaki to work on its movie adaptation, to which Miyazaki accepted on the basis that he be allowed to direct. In 1983, during production of the Nausicaa film, Miyazaki's mother passed away at the age of 72, and his devotion to his work kept him from being there for her final moments. This devastation motivated him to make his film as entertaining as possible in order to bring more joy into the world, and he poured his entire heart and soul into the production. In 1984, at the age of 43, Miyazaki's first major hit film, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, was released to the public. The success of Nausicaa led Miyazaki to co-found his own animation studio in 1985 alongside his friends Takahata and Suzuki, which he named Studio Ghibli. With the help of funding from the Tokuma Shoten Publishing Company, Studio Ghibli released its first official feature film, Laputa, Castle in the Sky, in 1986, localized in the States to simply Castle in the Sky. Written and directed by Hayao Miyazaki, produced by Isao Takahata, and composed by Joe Hisaishi, Castle in the Sky became the highest-grossing animation of the year it was released in. What makes Miyazaki's animation style so unique is his incredible attention to detail. He will often go over his animators' frames and make adjustments himself, even discarding those he's most displeased with. He'd adjust small things like hair movement and facial expressions for the sake of his perfectionism, often overworking himself in the process. He would, however, maintain a casually friendly relationship with his animators and coworkers, running his studio with respect. He was not afraid to give his animators constructive criticism, and thus gained the respect and admiration of those working for him. When he would begin to feel the pressures of his job, he would retreat to a separate location to avoid taking his anger out on others, and each day his team would join him in morning exercises. While Miyazaki's next film, My Neighbor Totoro, would become the iconic feature of Studio Ghibli, Miyazaki himself wanted his following film, Kiki's Delivery Service, to feel different. The film would be a simple, slice-of-life tale like Totoro, but it would also contain a melancholic undertone that would leave the audience thinking. Miyazaki's following films, Porco Rosso and Princess Mononoke, would handle darker topics like death and morally gray characters, and each of these films would become international cult classics. Unfortunately, Miyazaki's dedication to his work distanced himself from his family, and his eldest son Goro testified that he felt his only connection to his father was through his films. In 1996, Studio Ghibli signed an agreement with Disney for the distribution of their films around the world, and in 1998, Miyazaki began planning construction for the Studio Ghibli Museum. He supposedly designed the layout himself with storyboards, as if the building itself was the product of an animation. Miyazaki wanted visitors to feel transported to another world, and he banned photography and filming within the museum because he'd prefer people experience it themselves. The Ghibli Museum finally opened to the public in October of 2001. Only a couple of months after the Japanese release of Hayao Miyazaki's magnum opus, Spirited Away.
This scene doesn't build Chihiro's character or even give us a glimpse into what she's feeling. Instead, the audience gets to feel something beautiful, something atmospheric, something ambivalent.
A famous rumor regarding Spirited Away is that it began production without a script, and there may be some truth to it. Hayao Miyazaki preferred to work visually, without a script, planning story beats through pictures and concept art instead. He'd find inspiration in everyday, ordinary scenery by capturing the unexpected and extraordinary. Whenever he'd get caught on a film idea, he'd switch his thinking around by rewriting the scene entirely. The more he draws, the more ideas come to him, and he's not afraid to discard whole concepts when something doesn't sit right with his vision. Spirited Away is unique in how it takes its time, creating moments of immense calm and contemplation as the protagonist continues on her journey, one step after the other. What's sometimes referred to as the pillow shot, Miyazaki refers to as ma, which is how he defines this state of calm in film. The train scene from Spirited Away is famous for the sudden slow of the film's heartbeat, as it takes place after a quick succession of intense moments for the protagonist, and this is finally her time to relax and think about the road ahead with the audience. Beautiful music composed by Joe Hisaishi gives the entire film an ethereal, classical feeling that simultaneously captures whimsy and sorrow. Truly, it is one of the greatest films of all time. In 2003, at the age of 62, Hayao Miyazaki won his first Oscar as Spirited Away was awarded Best Animated Feature at the 75th Academy Awards. It was reportedly the highest-grossing film in Japanese history, and the weight of its success would affect the future of the studio from then on. In 2006, while working on Ponyo on the Cliff by the Sea, localized to just Ponyo, Miyazaki had some difficulty planning out the scene depicting Ponyo and Sosuke's reunion. He turned away from his sketches and turned on Ride of the Valkyries by Richard Wagner. The song filled him with inspiration, and he drew a singular image of Ponyo standing atop a giant fish in the ocean. This gave him the head start he needed to draw the rest of the scene. He had no deadline to worry about, the film would be done when it's done after all, so he worked with maximum creative freedom. He'd occasionally changed the film's entire art style just to see what worked, and even included extra scenes that were incredibly personal to him. The first of such scenes involved Ponyo cheering up a sick baby, which Miyazaki said was to serve as a lesson for kids to be happy to be alive and enjoy living, because he doesn't want them to feel as he did as a child. The second scene takes place near the climax, after Ponyo has returned to being a fish and her father is chasing Sosuke. In this scene, an old woman named Toki beckons Sosuke to run to her. This woman, like many other characters in Miyazaki's works, is a metaphorical representation of his own mother, and by repeatedly putting her in his films, Miyazaki reconnects with his memory of her. By this point in his life, Hayao Miyazaki began to feel the weight of his age, as he lost many of his colleagues.
作品作ってる時だけが生きてる時だからです。戦う男であり続けるっていうことは、自分が生きていくっていうことになってるんだと思うんですよ。
In 2011, Miyazaki began planning his first film about a historical figure. The Wind Has Risen, localized to The Wind Rises, is a film about Jiro Horikoshi, the inventor of the Zero fighter plane used in World War II. This film would be very different from his previous works, as it would be discussing the sensitive topic of an engineer whose work caused the loss of many lives. However, he related to Horikoshi's devotion to his work as well as his admiration of flight. In many of his films, Miyazaki uses planes and airships to represent joy and freedom, as well as corruption in contexts of war, and this was his chance to express that through the lens of another creative mind. Miyazaki had difficulty working on this film as it was historical rather than fantastical, and his previous works relied on fantasy as an expression of their themes. Not long after he finished storyboarding the 1923 Tokyo earthquake for the film, the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake hit. The disaster left him rattled, and he began having second thoughts about how to depict such sensitive topics as this film would contain. He traveled directly to the wreckage sites of the earthquake to gain a deeper understanding of the tragedy, reminding himself of when he watched Utsunomiya burn down. He took inspiration from this trip and worked hard on the earthquake scene, helping to animate every detail within the large crowd of scrambling citizens. Miyazaki claimed that he long thought animation was for children, but this particular movie he would make for adults. The Wind Rises would become the first of Miyazaki's own movies that he would cry watching, and 2 months after its release he'd announce his 4th retirement. Or possibly his 7th retirement, as sources are mixed on the exact number. Despite his retirement, Hayao Miyazaki continued to work on the Studio Ghibli Museum, and in 2014 he received an honorary Oscar and Governor's Award for his impact on animation. However, in 2016 Miyazaki would retire from retirement once again for one last film, as he began animation work on How Do You Live, localized in the States to The Boy and the Heron. At the age of 75, Miyazaki began to reflect on his life and how his perspectives have changed throughout the years, and he wanted to express those feelings so badly that he began production for his final film before he received approval from his producer. At this point, Toshio Suzuki was convinced Miyazaki would never retire. The Boy and the Heron would be Miyazaki's most personal film, as it would include references to his own childhood. The protagonist faces the destructive effects of war, fails to connect with his aeronautics engineer father, begins to hate life at a young age, and mourns the absence of his mother in his life. However, this film serves as a requiem to his past, as the protagonist goes on a journey of reconciliation and healing, and in the end faces a decision Miyazaki wishes he never expected of his own son. To quote the YouTuber Cellspecs, anyone who's done any study into Miyazaki's work knows just how much of himself and his philosophy he puts into every film, which is why it's always so fascinating to see how his work and his narratives evolve. The Boy and the Heron would win Miyazaki his 2nd Oscar for Best Animated Feature at the 96th Academy Awards, which he was unable to attend due to his old age. Despite advertising the film as his truly last production, rumor has it that he's already started on another project. His old friend Suzuki has testified that he won't retire until Miyazaki does.